We've had 4 incredibly stimulating talks here about various aspects of human capital, about how to take responsibility for that, about what to do when it doesn't turn out like you wish it would, and about how research can inform us about this. We have some time for discussion, and I'd like to use that. I'd like to invite members of the audience to raise questions or comments that crossed your mind during these sessions. Who would like to start?
Hello. First of all, thank you for the lovely talks, very inspiring. I'm Nelly Konijndijk. I'm one of the coordinators of Women in Academia at the KU Leuven, so that's the university in Leuven. We are trying to improve the situation for women there. And one of the biggest problems we face, and I think that's no exception, is that the people in charge of these things are not always so willing to move, and that basically the will for or the commitment to change is something that comes from our grassroots organization but is not shared in the top of the organization. And this may be a very general question, but we are basically struggling with what are the first steps, what is the best thing as first steps to get that commitment higher up?
That's an extremely important question. Nancy, you're in the top leadership of your university, and we all know that one of the keys to success at cultural change in an institution is the commitment from the top. How do you convince colleagues who aren't on board that this is an important issue?
So I think one thing that's really useful, and we've learned a lot of it just today, is to really remind your leadership of how prevalent the new norms are, how many different federal and the European Horizon 2020, what NSF does, what a whole variety of sort of pedigree stamping, incentivizing external organizations are doing. And the more leaders hear that, the more they'll respond. I mean, it really matters in this case that there's sort of comfort in numbers, if you will. And in particular in numbers of organizations and other leadership groups that are seen as the arbiters of excellence. And I think that makes a huge difference.
Thanks. Dagmar, did you want to add to that?
Yes, I think. Thanks. I think also the number is very, very important, and I think also what I can I like to discuss the culture of an organization. And when we, for example, when we discuss in the German science system in the 21st century that the highest scientific quality is R, yeah, but that had nothing to do with quotas, with gender equality. You have to mention, and you mentioned that quotas can raise equality and so on. And I think if you have in the organization something like a culture or atmosphere that this is not possible to think and to discuss it like a contradiction. That's, I think, very important to change a little bit something like the organization culture and therefore also the heads of the management.
Thank you. Daniela.
Yeah. I have two curiosity about the ERC presentation, which I liked very much, by the way. And one is the time frame, because you said that it went from November 12 to January 14. Now, usually the program are 5 years for ERC, right? So is this the beginning, the end of your project is what? So I wanted to know the larger project, let's say, and what you are aiming at the end. And the second question is, did you get any feedback from the Council?
Let me start with your second question. No, not yet. I'm talking to Isabel Bernolson, who's chairing the Gender Balance Working Group. We will meet with the working group, I think, hopefully in October. because literally we left the end part of our report open because we think there's a lot of dilemmas in there. There's no easy answers. There's choices to be made. I can only make recommendations. I cannot make choices for them. And I also think that a lot of the actual implementation of our recommendations is also much more their job than ours. So we will talk. Absolutely, and then there will be more communication about our findings. There will be a short report which should be available soon, and if you email me, I can also send it to you directly. Now I'm going to get a host of emails. The second part of the first of your question, where are we? This is a CSA project, so it's coordination and support, which means it's a one-year project, one-year funding, and it's already ended. So we submitted our report in March, and this is where we are currently. Yes.
I've been working for 25 years in a study center on gender equality in Bologna. We work with enterprises, and in our experience, you can change top management attitude, culture, and policies, mainly for two reasons. The first one, the top management has to see its advantage. It can be a financial advantage, it can be a reputation advantage, whatever, but they have to see an advantage. The second reason is when there has been a strong lobby of women asking for change. It's not so common, but it happens. These are the most common reasons for which top management change their policies. And I'd like to add another factor, very important, that we experience every day, the low level of women's empowerment in enterprises, but I don't think it's very different in universities. Women bring to work environment their gender identity that enterprises value very much, they know very well and take advantage of it, but they bring also behaviors and that don't favor their career. They are invisible, they ask less, and so on. So training, seminars, to increase women's empowerment. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Would any of you like to comment on that? It sounds eminently sensible. We agree.
And I think sometimes one of the problems or challenges we have is that when women at their own institution advocate for change, sometimes it be considered simply self-serving. Right? Instead of looking to increase the opportunities for everybody, make the pie bigger, it looks to be self-serving. As a colleague once told me, it's difficult to be a prophet in your own land. In which case, then I think what we need to do is look across institutional boundaries. We need to reach to experts and colleagues at other institutions and bring them in as the guides, as the experts, to help convince. And that I found great success. My own personal is that I was having difficult making strides in this area at my own previous university until another university hired me to be their consultant. And the other university was a more highly ranked medical center than the institution I was employed by. A week later, I was called by the medical school administration to come and talk with them about the issue. So I think that that's the opportunity. So sometimes when we are looking to fight only within our own institution, because that's the culture that we're part of and we're looking to make the changes most quickly, we have to seek some guidance from outside and understand that we may not be able to do it on our own, even if we're going about it the right way.
Excellent. Who would like to make a comment? Yes.
I would like to ask Professor Winkelberg, thank you, the whole panel, for wonderful insights. I have a question about those wonderful graphs, the dances that you were mentioning, and you shared also the differences between the institutional types. I was curious what kind of differences you could see between the different countries, especially North and South of Europe and East and West, if there were any, in terms of what kind of careers are more, or patterns are more prevalent because of different governance regimes and funding and all that.
Well, very good question, thank you. Of course there are differences. The problem is, however, that within our participants there are, every single person has, first of all, 3 nationality variables, because it could be, you know, in the most extreme case, they're coming from country A originally, where they were born, could actually not be their nationality now, but that's where they were born. They're applying to the ERC from country B, aiming to go to country C. So, you know, to give you just one straight answer is quite hard. We have looked at some descriptive data for sort of logical regions, let's say the North versus the Germanic versus the Southern European, and there are some differences, mainly in like the let's say the prevalence of certain patterns, but nothing that's really conclusive. So it's varied, yes, and I can look at the data for you afterwards to see exactly what is where. But it's difficult to give one simple answer. Thank you.
All right. Yes, back here.
Hi, I'm Fiona Jenkins from the Australian National University's Gender Institute. I wanted to ask Claudia about the levels of investment, if you like, the euro value that's going differentially into men and women when you've got something like just 20% women getting these research grants, and whether you're able with your data to track at all how that differential funding impacts on the career trajectory, if you think about it as a career investment as much as something that's intended to produce quality research.
That is a very good question, again. Are you asking from the moment of application on, so, or also retrospectively?
Well, I'm thinking more retrospectively, perhaps. I mean, I'm thinking in the wider context where we're worrying about gender equality in academia broadly. I mean, certainly in the Australian context, I've looked a little bit at my own discipline and been quite scandalised by just an approximation of the differences in investment in dollar terms that are going to men and women.
Yeah. Well, I think maybe this is actually a question that the ERC can answer better than that I would. But I will give it a try. Well, let's say first of all that the success rate overall, if I'm not mistaken, for anybody applying to the ERC on average is 10%. So that means that people are going to a huge amount of time. There's also a crisis of expectation. People generally overestimate their own chances of getting the grants because otherwise they wouldn't even go there, right? They wouldn't fill out the complete package. We've also talked to some people in interviews, and this is anecdata, I'm sorry, Kurt, who say, can't they just ask us to first fill in a short application, and then when we go to the first round, then only submit the full proposal, because it's so much work, and your chances of getting it are just very low. Then, of course, within that 10%, there's a clear gender difference. And that, I would say, but I'm really speaking on, my personally here, is definitely a waste of money and a waste of talent. So I think that's one of the reasons why the ERC is looking into this and has been looking into this quite steadily. There's other CSA projects running or have been running from the ERC that do not take gender so much into account, but look at what the impact is of getting this kind of grant prospectively. So what does it mean in terms of a new generation of researchers who are hired on this money? What does it mean in terms of impact? What does it mean in terms of innovation, value, etc. So but that's not split by gender. It's different projects. Thank you.
Yes.
Again, I'm Myung-jae Kim, distinguished visiting professor of the Korea Advanced Institute of Science and Technology from the Republic of Korea. First of all, I'm of the view that the slogan of the Gender Summit Euro 4, from ideas to market, is an excellent choice because it should embrace the wide spectrum of the so-called national innovation system. If I may raise a question in the interest of active discussion, I got the impression that the cases we are dealing today sound very much like good or better practice, if not the best practice, from the eyes of the participants of the developing economy. Because this summit, Gender Summit, is expanding to the region of Africa and Asia Pacific next year, so that considering that fact, that the agenda should be different according to the characteristics of the stage of the development and differing socio-economic and cultural background of the nation state. In that sense, I would like to ask you a question. What would be your recommendation to the emerging economies where the social perception and infrastructure are quite different from the advanced economies in terms of the policy to promote the gender equality in policies and measures? This may be a sudden or abrupt question, but I'd like to hear your advice or recommendations.
Yeah, I think that's an extremely stimulating question, and I can imagine that all of my colleagues here would like to say something, and that might be actually a very interesting way to go here. I think that one of the things that's most exciting about the decision to take the Gender Summit on the road is the opportunity to consider these kinds of cultural differences and what they mean in this context. But I don't want to dominate, so why don't I just...
Go ahead.
Well, I think that, I guess if I were to say one thing that I have found to be, since I live in Norway and I'm often asked even by colleagues in other European countries, why are things so different in Norway? And it's hard to pin that down. As we saw this morning, some things aren't so different, but some things are. And one of the things that I think is very different in Norway, having just spent a year living in the Netherlands, is that there's a very great degree of gender balance at home, at least relatively speaking, compared to some other European countries. And I think that's a very important cultural issue that needs to be discussed and tied into the kinds of career situations in which we're talking about gender balance. And there also, I would want to carry out those discussions on the basis of solid research and cultural variation along those points. And we could all say much more, but then I really would like to draw the rest of you in. Nancy, what kind of thoughts do you get on that topic?
So I guess I would go at it a little bit the way I gave my talk. I mean, that is that I really do think the closer we tie science to societal challenges and embed it on the ground and make the teams more inclusive, the more chance we have of energizing a broader range of a society, and then working from that in culturally appropriate ways back into what one might call the more typical science model. And I think certainly the cross-cultural social psychology that I know very well would support that you really play to the motivating issues and norms and cultures and work back from that. And certainly as you well know, in the Asian context, the collective, collaborative infrastructure in culture is much better developed than in the cultures that were just being reported about. So working from that backwards in that sense, I mean, is a heads up, a leg up, if you will.
Thanks. First of all, you mentioned the wonderful slogan from excellence to market. I think also the slogan from market to excellence is really a wonderful slogan, because sometimes we have these linear model in mind from the basic research to products, yeah, but and also Martina pointed it out, yeah, it's very, very important are these interactions between scientists, researchers, and practitioners, and laypersons, and so on, with regard to innovation processes. That's first. With regard to your question, it's a little bit difficult, but I think you find your own way, and with regard, for example, the science system in Singapore, that's a completely different model with regard to our models in the European system, and that works. And I think what also you pointed out, your traditions, your culture, and so on, is a very, very important to mention, to think what are your strengths, what are the weaknesses of the science system. But I think collaboration with other international organizations is very important, but also what I pointed out, to have scientific organizations and persons, professors, or the leaders of universities, which stands for reputation, and if they are engaged in gender equality issues, that's, I think, very, very important to go on.
Yes, I'd like to add to that in a different way, and again close to the ground, which I think comes from the presentation that I just gave, but also from other work that I've been doing on work-family issues. And Marloes van Engen, who's also here, and I just hosted a session in New York at a conference on differences within similarities and similarities within differences among dual-earner couples. And we had beautiful presentations from different African countries and Southeast Asian countries, and where sometimes you actually, when you ask the question beyond the question and you look at the similarities actually that are there, you find very interesting things. So in that sense, I think it's just, let's not just simply assume that things are very different. A lot of things will be very, very similar, especially for dual earner couples, which also in developing countries will be a big part of your group when you talk about careers in science. And just to give you one example, really interesting from a presentation from, I think, Sri Lanka, was that, no, not true, it's from India actually, when they are negotiating marriage, it's not just, of course, the future partners at the table, it's also their parents, parents-in-law, prospective parents-in-law. The work-family issues are negotiated out before the marriage starts. So if you have a beautiful daughter with a scientific career ahead of her going to MIT to do a postdoc, they decide beforehand who goes with them to take care of an eventual child. And I thought that was so informative and so very different from my own notions of romantic and, oh, we will see that when it happens. So those are kinds of issues behind the immediate questions that I think are very interesting.
So to build on what's been said, but to play to cultural strengths instead of worrying about being the same, I think so the opportunity to build on areas of strength of community and collaboration versus an emphasis on the individual, that's good. And really the opportunity not to make the same mistakes as developed countries, not to base things on conventional wisdom, and not to use anecdotes to guide development of policy, but to stay focused on the data. That's an opportunity. And you don't have to follow the same path as the developed countries to make progress. And in fact, maybe there's the opportunity to make progress more quickly because I would argue that the developed countries haven't made progress quickly enough. So don't follow in our footsteps necessarily.
Oh, thank you very much. I didn't expect 4 answers to a single question. Thank you very much.
It was the guys don't count. But I've had one raised hand on my list, and I think we'll go with that, and then we'll wrap it up here.
That puts a lot of weight now on this final question. I was curious about your thoughts about the fact that I've recently had some conversations with a female executive in top European company, which will remain anonymous, and surprisingly, the women were very much against gender quotas because they said, now I have to work twice as hard. It was a predominantly male-dominated organization, and they were very much against the idea of having gender quotas, despite the data that you present that shows that it suggests that basically the performance would increase, or that it would support women's initiatives. And then the other thought I was trying to connect to Holly's points more about also our own biases and perceptions as women, and our own issues in terms of, the biases that we bring into the workforce. And then consequently, we're also could create situations like the queen bee effect, social penalties towards women. And there's also needs to be a conversation between changing the system and changing the women, in a sense that we want to change our own attitudes as women about women, and we want to see the system changing. And I'm just curious about, how we can bring all of these, issues together.
As a question back to you, is when you say that the women were resisting the ideas of quotas, do you mean for things like committee composition, or you mean for hiring, or?
Anything from hiring for teams, for board. It seems that in general they're very much against to have gender quotas, meaning that they were there. Right. They said the men in their teams would think that they're not competent enough.
Right. So these are right. So I notice that when I speak about gender balance issues, the younger the audience, the more resistance there is from the women. And it's a very discouraging situation, because those are people at the beginning of their careers who remain committed to the idea that they want recognition for their actual accomplishments, and that affirmative action somehow undermines that. And it's, of course, I don't want to be in the position of disabusing them of their idealism. So it's a tricky thing to do. There was one speaker earlier today who, I'm not remembering who it was, who mentioned that, for example, quotas for committees, sometimes if you have 30% women in your organization and 50% of every committee has to be a woman, then that disproportionately burdens women. But in academia, for example, it's not hard to figure out how to compensate for that. For example, you view teaching and administration as one pot, and then you've solved that problem. So people who do more administration have, for example, a teaching reduction. My hope is, I guess, my continued belief in the power of research and in being able to talk about the kinds of findings that we can make when we study these things, and to try to get people away from their intuitions and onto research. But it's a tough row to hoe, as they say.
But there is research. In fact, there's a great paper when they put up role models, black sheep, or queen bees, and talking about those different models. So research shows this is the problem with tokenism. And gender identity. So women who are in token positions and minority tend to identify gender with the majority. And so a sole woman within a senior leadership ranks of an organization may identify more with the male gender, and felt that she needed to behave more like men to be seen as being competent. And now if the idea is that more women will be brought in, she doesn't have an identity either way. And so there's some really lovely literature more recent on the dealings of this is where then women can be women's own worst enemies. But it has everything to do with gender identity. And the more diversity and the more that you can have balance of gender, the less that's a problem, because then, in fact, the more that women identify with their gender, the better they are at supporting other women. And so this again goes to the issue of having token women. Oh, we'll have one woman on this committee. Does everybody considerable harm, especially any subsequent women, because you've put that first woman in a particularly difficult situation. So there are opportunities to have interventions that can overcome that, but that is a real challenge for those women, and not completely unexpected that they would be resistant then.
Thank you, Holly, and thank you for that interesting last question. I have a couple of announcements to make, but before I do that, please join me in thanking our panelists.